Good evening and welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore and connect and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this just a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this evening, featuring UIC alumna Monica Trinidad and art activist Sarah G., who are both featured in the Jane Addams Whole House Museum exhibit, True Peace, The Presence of Justice, as they discuss peace organizing led by Jane Addams and women around the world during World War I, with present-day social justice movements led by women and queer people of color that challenge prisons, policing, and demand justice. And joining them is Ross Stanton Jordan, who is the curator at the Jane Addams Whole House Museum. He supports productions of exhibits and programs that connect the social justice issues of the past to the present. Thank you to all three of you for being with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Ross to begin the program.
I want to thank the UIC Alumni Association for inviting us and our guest artists to talk about the work of the museum. In case you don't know, Jane Addams Whole House Museum draws upon the legacy of international peace activists and feminists, Jane Addams and other social reformers who lived and worked alongside their immigrant neighbors to create social change on the near west side of Chicago, of course, right where UIC is located. Founded in 1889, Whole House Settlement was a pioneering location for progressive era women's activism, demanding and creating a democratic society. In 2019, in September of 2019, on Jane Addams' 159th birthday, Whole House opened our exhibition, True Peace, The Presence of Justice. Let me try to get this slide here. This was in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. It's the exhibition that we'll be talking about tonight. But it also is a look at women's activism, past and present. And the exhibition's title is a quote often attributed to Jane Addams, which is, "True peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice." And here's a look at the exhibition as it is today. And of course, the museum right now is closed, so folks can't see the exhibition in person, but you can actually go to our website and there's a virtual tour that's available. In 1915, Jane Addams founded the American Women's Peace Party to oppose World War I. That party became the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. In 1915, that same year, in a radical and unprecedented action, Jane Addams and over 1,500 women traveled across warring countries to The Hague in the Netherlands to demand peaceful resolutions to World War I and more just alternatives to war. Here's another view of the exhibition. Many of the women were also prominent suffragists who were traveling with Jane Addams. And here are some images of the exhibition that capture women, including Jane Addams, traveling to The Hague demanding peace. And of course, I love this peace flag, right? This transgressive act, 5 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment, highlights the unique role and responsibility Jane Addams saw for women in civic engagement, to challenge the patriotic and patriarchal nationalistic views that actively fueled the war and posit a true peace that is only achievable through gender, economic, and social justice. This activism came with suspicion and state surveillance. So this exhibition also juxtaposes Jane Addams' Nobel Peace Prize that she won in 1931 and her FBI file. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI surveilled Jane Addams because she invited a mix of political speakers to Whole House. She led immigrant labor organizing activities, and she supported anti-war activism. All these activities were perceived by the FBI as suspicious and unpatriotic and un-American. Jane Addams would serve as the president of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom from its founding in 1915 through to 1929, presiding over 6 of the international conferences that sought for peace in the form of democracy, decolonization, women's rights, human rights, and civil rights. And so the exhibition, True Peace, the Presence of Justice, asks not only what does the legacy of women's international peace organizing look like, but also what does it look like today? And so to answer that question, we invited 2 Chicago-based artists to respond to that. And so by way of introduction, I'm going to talk about our artists via their contributions to the exhibition. Sarah G, who's joining us tonight, is a queer Korean mama. She's an organizer and photographer who has been documenting freedom struggles in Chicago since 2010. She is a member of the Love and Protect, a grassroots organization that supports women and gender nonconforming, non-binary people of color who have been criminalized or harmed by state and impersonal violence. Sarah G intentionally focused her documentation work on everyday people imagining and building a world rooted in love and justice, a world where we don't need police and prisons. She hopes that these images of resistance and reimagination will plant seeds in others to work for collective liberation. And Sarah G's contribution to the exhibition, True Peace, focuses on the activism and campaigns of justice led by Black women, queer folks, and trans folks in Chicago. So some of you might have participated in some of these organizing activities and activism activities. Those folks I mentioned are often erased or rendered invisible. And so this is a way to share their voice. In March 2020, several months after we opened the exhibition, we updated Sarah G's display on the first floor of the museum with documentation of the fall 2019 Chicago Teachers Union protest that was demanding equitable access in education. So this is just a way to give you a sense of, we open up exhibitions and often we'll reopen them to respond to the changing climate and changing activity. Monica Trinidad is a queer Latinx artist and organizer born and raised on the South Side of Chicago. Monica is a co-founder of Brown and Proud Press. She's also of the People's Artist Collective and the People's Response Team. Monica's actively uses her art practice to push for spaces both artists and organizers can recognize the necessity of cultural organizing as a key to effecting social change and imagining alternatives to policing and prisons. She has created artwork for over 20 organizations and efforts in Chicago to support organizational visibility, growth, and success. Monica is an emerging member of Just Seeds, an artist cooperative committed to social, environmental, and political engagement. Her work is in the permanent collections of the DuSable Museum of African American History and the National Museum of Mexican Art. And Monica is a 2010 grad of UIC. Monica's contribution to the exhibition are portraits of activists Benji Hart, Kelly Hayes, Yoon Yul, Miriam Kaba, and of course, our good friend Sarah G. And they highlight campaigns and movements for justice in Chicago from 2014 through to 2019. They have largely been led by folks of color, Black and brown folks of color, and women and young girls. And Trinidad really tries to locate local ties to resistance to police brutality and state violence here in Chicago to broader struggles against police violence, militarization in the US and abroad. So these are some of the images of the campaigns and both the portraits in the exhibition. In March 2020, Hull House updated True Peace and launched In Progress, a decade of people's struggles in Chicago. And this is an interactive mural of grassroots activism and organizing in Chicago between 2010 and 2019 by Monica Trinidad and Gray Rose. And this is a way that people can actually respond to the exhibition. So if you open, you'll be able to actually write your answer to this question about how you commit to justice and beyond in 2020. With that, I'm going to pass this on to Monica to get us started in talking about her contribution to the exhibition and her perspective on true peace. Here's another shot of the exhibition. I think, is Monica still muted?
Me off this mute. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now? Yes, good. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about two of the pieces that are in the exhibition. The campaigns that I'm talking about are We Charge Genocide and the No Cop Academy. Ross, if you could go to my first slide. Yeah, there you go. Cool. Okay. So yeah, there's this really long legacy of organizers, revolutionaries, and leaders taking their stories of struggle to the United Nations to bring a larger international spotlight on human rights issues. And so in 2014, this effort called We Charge Genocide emerged in Chicago after the police murder of a young Black man named Dominique Franklin, or as his friends known him as was Damo. I remember being roped into this effort to support with social media and visual arts pretty early on. And then I volunteered to be part of a delegation to deliver a report to the United Nations on police violence against young people of color in Chicago later that year, which we were gonna, write and develop together, right, based on research that had been done prior to our efforts in We Charge Genocide, right, and then also utilizing the stories and narratives of young people that had experienced police violence. So in this photo, you see our delegation in this moment of direct action inside of the United Nations, which is a whole story in itself, but I'll just briefly say that there was a lot of power in a bunch of young organizers, artists, poets, utilizing art and social media and personal narrative in this effort to cut through sort of the conventional methods that were used before us, right? Of sort of giving the facts, giving the statistics, giving the data. We sort of came in with spoken word poetry, with beautiful, vibrant artwork, showing Damo's face as the US was being questioned by the United Nations. We really just had this very bold presence at the UN, which is why I believe that the US was, the Chicago police were directly named in the United Nations findings after the Convention Against Torture was finished. And Miriam Kaba, who brought us all together for this, she was known, she's like a mentor of mine, she's a friend of mine, many people know her. Her portrait is up in the whole house that I painted as well. She was knowingly building upon the work of those before us, because the name We Charge Genocide actually comes from a petition filed to the UN in 1951 by Black organizers and artists. So while there's definitely this long tradition of collecting testimonies of human rights violations and taking them to the United Nations, there's actually never been a specifically youth-led effort. So this was unique in that sense, but still building upon the work of those who came before us. This 1951 petition documented over 150 killings of Black people by police and vigilantes. And Miriam felt that by grounding and naming ourselves with that history, we would contextualize our struggle against police violence. And what she meant by that was that for as long as there's been policing, there has been resistance to that policing, especially in Chicago. And it's important to not only weave incidents of police violence together to expose this long legacy of violence being inherent to policing as an institution, but also to weave together our stories of resistance as well, right? So that's just as equally as important to do. So in the next slide, you'll see that I illustrated this poster 1 year after our efforts as sort of a quick documentation of our collective work. Because not only did we go to the United Nations, we also revived cop watching efforts in Chicago. We organized public hearings for young people to have space to testify their experiences with police violence, and also supported the tail end of a decade-long fight for reparations for John Birch torture survivors. So there was a lot of work that was done within this effort, but most importantly, what I think was learned from this effort, for me at least, was that education and documentation were and are two critical strategies in movement work. It also made me realize and understand how we have to have multiple points of entry for people to tap in to this organizing work, right? So for me, that was using my creativity and uplifting the role that art can play in helping us envision a more just future. And artwork doesn't always have these like precise measurable outcomes, which can make it a little difficult to like, you know, sort of feel as this tangible, you know, essential piece of organizing, but it really does open up crucial space to expand our imaginations and to think beyond what's like right in front of us, right? And like Ross said, everyone can see this piece in permanent collection at the DuSable Museum of African American History and at the Hull House Museum, of course, not right now, but once it opens up again. You can go to the next slide, and I guess fast forwarding to a few years later to 2017, many of us who were part of We Charge Genocide were now deeply involved in an effort called No Cop Academy, which was a campaign to stop the construction of a $95 million police academy in West Garfield Park, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood in Chicago. And again, creativity and art were integral to this organizing strategy. And when we launched the campaign with a call for art, the prompt was, how would you spend $95 million in your community? And we invited people to submit their artwork from their communities and really highlight the multitude of ways that we could spend $95 million in our communities, especially communities that have had public schools closed, mental health clinics closed, which you see so much of, you know, those struggles in a lot of Sarah G's documentation and photography. And you know, after we did this call for art, we exhibited the artwork and we held a panel with artists and organizers talking about the campaign and how folks could get plugged in. So sort of like, you know, come for the art, leave with an organizing task sort of thing. And at the end of the campaign last year, we ended up losing the votes that would block the police academy from being built. But so many other types of wins came out of this effort. I will also note that the police academy is not built yet. So in some ways we are still winning, because Rahm Emanuel wanted to build it he wanted it to go up in 2018, early 2018, and it's still not up yet. But, you know, Miriam Kaba wrote a love letter to No Cop Academy organizers after we lost this vote. And she said the following words I want to read that really summarize the campaign. And Miriam said, "No Cop Academy is an abolitionist organizing campaign, and through your work, you've helped others understand what it means when we say that abolition is a practical organizing strategy. You pointed out all of the resources that this Cop Academy will swallow up and told the city that those resources should be diverted to life-giving institutions. You asked the right questions like, why are we feeding an institution that leads to the premature death of so many Black and brown people, especially young ones? And you embodied No Cop Academy organizer Benji Hart, pictured here, Benji Hart's analysis of abolition as a way to, quote, transform our reactions to individual traumatic events into codified political commitments. And you showed that abolition as a project is about building a vision of a different world, one where everyone has their needs met and where Black lives matter." So it's really with these words that I continue to do this work every day. And both Benji and Miriam, like I said, are highlighted in this True Peace exhibition in the portrait section alongside other important movement leaders. And their work is deeply embedded in this timeline you've seen photos of. And then especially if you go to the next slide, you'll see, you know, the illustration I did of Benji in City Hall, you know, right, doing No Cop Academy press conferences and holding down speeches inside of City Hall, like, has been sort of like placated on the timeline. And yeah, this timeline includes the last 10 years of grassroots struggle in Chicago, and it gives examples of so many of these different points of entry into various efforts for justice, and leaves you with this prompt: how will you commit to justice in 2020 and beyond? And I wrote this question before COVID, before the uprisings, so it seems even more of a pivotal question to be returning back to in this moment that we're in, is how are we going to commit, and what ways that organizers like me and Sarah and Benji are, offering these multitudes of entry points, into our organizing spaces. How are you going to commit, and how are you going to enter those points of entry in 2020 and beyond? Because this fight is definitely far from over. So, thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I'm going to let Sarah G take it away for our next presentation. Then after, we're going to have a conversation between us, and then also have a chance for Q&A with the audience as well. Sarah, go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Okay, so thank you so much for having Monica and me on this panel. I actually went to UIC for a little bit back in the 90s, before it got beautified. So glad to be a part of this. So I am just gonna jump right in, and I'm not like Monica. I don't talk on panels very often, so I'm a little nervous, so bear with me. So we are currently in a historical moment in which globally people are declaring that Black Lives Matter, and they're calling for the dismantling of centuries of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Additionally, years of failed reforms have brought us to this abolitionist moment where we unequivocally challenge and call for the tearing down of the final vestiges of chattel slavery, that is, the prison industrial complex, which includes not only prisons, but also policing and surveillance. During my evolution in the past decade as an abolitionist and organizer, the person who has influenced my political and personal development the most is educator and organizer Miriam Kaba, whom Monica has already spoken about. She's the one who taught me the concept of making Black Lives Matter as an organizing framework, going beyond just saying that Black Lives Matter to creating the material conditions and systemic changes that truly value Black lives. Because the prison industrial complex is rooted in slavery, the work of making Black Lives Matter is an abolitionist project. The work of creating the conditions in which all Black people are truly free is an abolitionist project. So what we're currently witnessing in our city and across the nation today didn't happen overnight. Communities have been organizing and fighting and resisting police violence for years. As I've personally witnessed the protests in the streets this summer and have joined the call of Black abolitionists in Chicago to defund CPD, I'm filled with the memories of the struggles that I've documented for years in this city. And as demonstrated in this exhibition of Monica's work and my documentation, Black women, trans, and non-binary folks have been at the forefront of much of that organizing and have also literally put their bodies on the line. Additionally, Chicago was one of the first cities to lift up the Say Her Name campaign a number of years ago, which highlighted the fact that Black women are also targets of state violence. The struggle for justice for Rekia Boyd, who was a young Black woman murdered by off-duty cop Dante Servin, lasted for years until Servin finally resigned. Additionally, one of the first explicitly abolitionist marches that I can remember was organized by Assata's daughters in July of 2016 in the Washington Park neighborhood. An organization such as Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration and Love and Protect lift up the many women who are incarcerated, often for defending themselves against violence. They remind us the impact that mass incarceration has on women, particularly Black women, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, who are often left to be the caregivers of families left behind when members of their community are incarcerated, be they men or women. We cannot forget the connection between policing and prisons, but the job of police is literally to put people in prison, which we know through research and real life does not keep our communities safe. Over the past years, more and more people are seeing that the term police brutality is actually a misnomer because it implies that such violence is out of the ordinary, when in fact the institution of policing itself, much like prisons, is inherently violent. Therefore, policing cannot be separated from violence. And that brings us to this moment where more and more people are looking to abolition instead of reform. Monica spoke on the work of We Charge Genocide and the organizing to resist police violence in Chicago. And something that came out of that effort was the popularization of the fact that Chicago Police Department were being given 40% of the city's operating budget, to the tune of $4 million a day back then. We're up to almost $5 million a day today. And so the question, what would you do with $4 million a day to create community safety, began to enter mainstream dialogue. In the midst of mental health clinic closures, mass school closures, widespread disinvestment in Black and Brown communities, here was the Chicago Police Department getting millions of dollars a day. To put things in perspective, one day of that CPD budget would have kept the 6 mental health clinics closed by ROM open for a whole year. And so it made sense that organizers would call for the reallocating of the budget from a violent system that wasn't keeping our neighborhoods safe to things that actually would address the root causes of violence. In addition to these early years of organizing around divest, invest strategies, the struggle for reparations for police torture survivors came to a head in 2015. The reparations ordinance that was passed after decades of organizing by survivors and family members and artists and activists used restorative ways of addressing the horrific injustice of Commander Burge's years of torture. The ordinance itself was born out of a call to artists to create ways to memorialize the experience of the torture survivors so that the city and the world would never forget. So this struggle, this reparations ordinance, which gave monetary compensation to survivors, free city colleges, education to survivors and family, an official apology from the city, free counseling, and creating curriculum for all CPS students that would teach what happened. This gave us a glimpse of what justice would look like that didn't involve punishment, but restorative practices. And it furthered our collective vocabulary on abolition. So Monica has already spoken a lot about No Cop Academy. And as she said, a few years ago, some organizers who were working with youth in the city became aware that ROM was quietly trying to create this $95 million Cop Academy in Garfield Park. The No Cop Academy campaign brought together over 100 organizations across the city demanding that this plan be abandoned. They demanded that if the city had $95 million to spend on training cops, that the money should instead be invested in what the Black and Brown No Cop Academy youth organizers were calling for: education, after-school programs, job training, investment in their communities. The current Defund CPD campaign that we are in right now is a direct descendant of the No Cop Academy campaign. And so here we are, thousands of people marching through the streets this summer, demanding that the city defund CPD and invest in communities. I want to be clear that abolition is most definitely about eliminating the prison industrial complex, but we know that that won't happen overnight. Miriam Kaba has often said that abolition is a verb. It's about doing, building, creating in the now, not just looking towards a horizon. And here in Chicago, we have been doing abolition, whether we call it that or not. And so now I just want to share a few examples using some photos from the exhibition of these abolitionist projects that have been happening over the years in Chicago. Here we have young Black youth organizers who won a trauma center for the South Side after a half decade of agitating and organizing. This is abolition. Mental health movement organizers are still fighting for accessible mental health care that is not punitive or carceral. They know they are fighting for their lives. And this is abolition. Thousands of people have fought school closings over the years in Chicago and continue to fight for quality schools in all neighborhoods. This is abolition. Parents, grandparents, and community members went on a hunger strike to keep Diet High School open. They set an example for the whole city of the kind of sacrifice people are willing to make for their communities. And this is abolition. And the CTU strike that happened in both 2012 and 2019 are examples of how the struggles for racial and economic justice in the city intersect. The CTU has set an example of solidarity, and what they are fighting for, a just city for all, is in and of itself an abolitionist project. And now I want to end with two quotes. The first is the one that Ross shared with us at the beginning, the one by Jane Addams, which gives us the title of our exhibition. True peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. And the second quote is by abolitionist scholar Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who said that abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah G. I really appreciate that presentation, and it's so great to see your photos again, and good to share them with people who can't visit the museum in person. I think now we're going to do some quick moderated conversation with me and Sarah G and Monica. If they can come on, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think, so they can see us. Okay, and Monica, I think you're still on mute. Unmute, kind of unmute you. Great, okay. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was really good to hear you both talk about your work and your activism and the intersection of art with that. So my first question, I'm just trying to kind of connect some of the history in the exhibition with your current work. And Jane Addams, at the beginning of World War I, was really making space for what she saw as a special role for women to call for peace at the time. Like, this is the close to the turn of the century. Women couldn't vote, but they were seen as activists that could really be connected to peace and humanity. And she saw that role as particular for women in a time of war. True Peace, you both, in the exhibition, you both focus on the activism of women, the activism of queer folks. And I'm wondering, why is it important, in your own language, why it's important that women and queer folks are leading these current campaigns for justice right now? And maybe I'll just direct, like, Monica, if you want to answer that question first.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to always have efforts led by people that are directly impacted by the oppressions and by the violence that they're experiencing. I think that those people are most equipped to come up with the solutions and the vision for moving forward to a place of feeling safe and having everything you need. And I think that where we are finding ourselves often running into this, where we see history repeating itself and where we see these moments almost on like this repeat, it's because we're not, one of the many reasons why it keeps happening, right, is that because we are not following that leadership of those directly impacted, or really trusting, I think trusting Black people and trusting especially Black trans women with the vision for liberation is essential in the work that we're doing. And I think that that's why this exhibition is so beautiful to me, because we have that moment to highlight all of these different people, both past, present, future, that are doing this work, which are, I mean, every effort I've been part of since 2014 have been led by Black women, Black queer women, Black gender nonconforming people. And I think that's in part why so many of those efforts are as successful as they are, and as visible as they are. Could be more visible, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you pretty much said what I would say. Like, I think it's really important. Also, like within the context of this exhibition, specifically to recognize how women, femmes, non-binary people, trans people have borne the brunt of violence in our society. So when we talk about, police violence, often the images that come to mind are images of Black men. But like campaigns like Say Her Name, which I had mentioned, put the focus on the Black women who have also been killed by police and who are also subject to state violence. And just the fact that mass incarceration has a huge impact on women who may not be the ones who are specifically incarcerated, but they're the ones that are left to take care of the children. They're the ones that travel to visit the people in prison, and I've been on these buses with like grandmothers and aunts who are taking children to visit their mothers in prison, and that care often mostly falls on women. And so state violence definitely has a huge impact. And so it makes sense that they would be the ones organizing, for their own freedom.
Thank you. Kind of alongside the lines of who we raise up is really important. And because it tells us who should we remember. And of course, Black women, trans folks, queer folks, these marginalized populations are less documented, less followed, less tracked. And this is a key example at Hull House. Jane Addams was a prolific writer, and so was a lot of women around her. And they wrote a lot, they took photographs a lot. They tried to really capture the work they were doing so they could reflect on it, but also so they could share it with other people. That's why I love the 2 images of the women traveling to The Hague, because if we didn't have those images, there would actually be no way to know what that looked like. What's interesting about Hull House's immediate neighborhood is that there's very little information about the immigrants that Hull House was serving. Who were they, what their experiences were like. We have to extrapolate from the words of Jane Addams and the other women reformers that were around them. So one of the reasons I think we gravitated toward both of your work is that it felt like documentation. It felt like working out. So what does that documentation mean for these movements, right? When I think this, especially to you, Sarah G, like you were out at many, many protests in Chicago, documenting what's going on. What's the meaning behind that documentation? What do you think it does in the world, and what does it do for you?
I think that it's really important that people who are struggling or who are, basically fighting their own freedom struggles be able to tell their own stories. And a lot of what I document is work that is not going to be captured by, like mainstream media. And I document work of organizations that I actually have relationships with. And that's been a really important part of how I work, is being accountable to the people whose stories I'm sharing, and that to me, that's, it's precious, and I have to be respectful of that. And also what I'm documenting is it's a visual repository of resistance in Chicago. It's our history. It's a visual reminder of where we've been and what we've done, the struggles that we've had, the victories that we've won. And it's important that people be able to see that we can in fact win. We have to be able to believe that we'll win. And I think the images that I've been documenting over the years show that, we've had some really significant wins over the past decade that I've been doing this. And there's always so much more work to do, but being able to document along the way, it gives me hope, And something Marian Kaba always says is hope is a discipline. And that's a mantra that I hold on to and trying to practice. And being able to document these struggles does give me that hope.
Monica, do you want to respond to that too? And then I think I'm going to go to the Q&A for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo the importance of documentation, and I'm so thankful that Sarah G exists in Chicago. We are so lucky to have Sarah G documenting all of our movements right now, because I think what happens when we don't do that is that Black women, especially women and Black women in particular, tend to be erased from history. It's you know, I'm thinking right now of the 19th Amendment, right? Because this is the 100th year, you know, anniversary of white women's right to vote, right? Because Black women couldn't vote until, you know, decades later, yet they were a crucial part of the fight for the 19th Amendment, for the right for women to vote. And you know, women like Ida B. Wells and Hallie Quinn and Sojourner Truth, all of these Black women were literally fighting white suffragists constantly, who were saying, you know, you have to wait until we have the right to vote for you to get the right to vote, or who were segregating them from marches, you know, like, you can't march with us. But and then when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the two white suffragists, wrote the history of this suffrage movement, they literally left Black women out of the book, you know, and that is the history that is now in our history books, right? And so literally we're having to like rewrite this history and this narrative of Black women being in leaders in the suffrage movement. And I think that, you know, and that just brings it back to like why we do what we do, why I make art that documents movements, why Sarah G documents our movements, is because otherwise our histories will be erased. And so it's a method of, it's activism. Documentation is activism and organizing, and art making is activism and organizing. And so I think that's, yeah, just what I wanted to know, especially, you know, with the whole house and the year that it is. I just wanted to bring that into the space.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. And the museum does have a current exhibition up called Why Women Should Vote, that's also based on a piece that Jane Addams wrote in 1910 that makes an effort to convince immigrant women, particularly, that they should be wanting to fight for the right to vote. And it also lifts up Ida B. Wells as well. And you can see that exhibit on our website virtually or right now. Do we have questions from the audience that we can answer?
Yeah, so I actually want to follow up on just something that you have all said, which is the coronavirus has shut down so many of our usual avenues for sharing artistic expression. I know you just said this was online, Ross, but I'm wondering, or I'm not wondering, this is the question. What avenues do artists have for sharing your work right now? And how has that changed?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that question. What we've been pivoting to a lot has been to curate window exhibitions. So I've curated multiple exhibitions in Chicago, at the Co-Prosperity Sphere in Bridgeport. There was a window exhibit, and the P.O. Box Collective in Rogers Park, and then the Yuri Eichen Gallery in Pilsen all had a lot of artwork outside for people to walk by and see. I've been seeing lots of virtual exhibitions that have been happening. You know, my day job is social media and communications, and so I'm seeing the like plethora of like content overload that is like wild and out online, that is overwhelming so many of us. But I think that I think it's great for me because art and social media is like my thing, and it's, you know, how I move around in this organizing world. And so I think it's been bittersweet because it's a place online as a place to connect with people right across the globe, and in ways like in visual ways and auditory ways and reading ways. But at the same time, you're also seeing institutions reaching out to Black artists right now, being like, oh, we want to highlight you. Oh, we want to put your art in our museum. Oh, we want to do this, but have never done it before and are just utilizing this moment to sort of almost tokenize Black artists. So I'm part of an artist collective called For the People. We're Black artists and artists of color in Chicago, and we support each other in our art making, and then also support movements in visuals that are needed. And we are constantly having internal conversations, making sure that institutions that are reaching out to us are offering stipends, offering honorariums, and respecting artists' time and labor, especially Black trans artists and labor. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. So I know Ross talked a little about this just when he was introducing you in your bios, but the question is, how did you become involved in working for justice? And then specifically for Sarah, why did you choose to document the CTU strike? And I'm also going to add on to that question was there a moment that all of a sudden something happened and you went, this is really where my passion is and I need to make a difference in the world this way?
Yeah, I'll start. So yeah, I kind of have a story. So back in 2010, September of 2010, my daughter was entering CPS. And previously in the months leading up to that, I started researching CPS and I was like, oh my gosh, there are problems. And so I knew I had to do something, that I had to get involved in the fight for education justice. And that fall, a struggle like that actually transpired in Pilsen when at the Whittier Dual Language Academy, some parents took over the field house that CPS was planning to demolish, that they had been using for decades as a community center. And so CPS was going to quietly spend $345,000 to just demolish this community center. And they said nope, and they took it over 24/7 for 43 days. And I saw a Facebook post. That's how it all started. It was a Facebook post. I saw what was happening and I was like, well, I know how to take pictures. I had no connection to the community and I don't, recommend this, but I showed up with my camera and I ended up going every day because people had to be there 24/7 to make sure that the parents didn't get kicked out. And so it was through that experience that I learned about what solidarity looks like. Like, what does it mean to show up in a struggle that you may not be a part of in the community per se, but how can you show up in that struggle in a way that's principled? And so I did what I knew how to do, which was to use my camera, organizing shifts for people to show up. And I developed a lot of relationships that way that connected me to the grassroots struggles that were happening in Chicago. And that was the first struggle that I documented, and the rest is history, I guess.
Yeah, I have a couple of entry points. One of my entry points was actually at UIC. As in my first or second year at UIC, I got involved in anti-war organizing on campus. And I was walking in the student center and I saw activists that were protesting military recruiters on campus who were trying to recruit, people on campus. And UIC's, a very diverse working class commuter campus. And so I, learned more about just like the ways that the military preys on poor people of color, and joined efforts to challenge the war. My dad is also a Vietnam veteran, and so I saw firsthand the ways that war impacts people, and violence and state violence in particular. And so, and so I sort of got involved then in organizing. And then fast forwarding to 2014, actually, We Charge Genocide also was a sort of point of entry for me, with utilizing the social media skills that I have and knowing that I had to play a role in the Black Lives Matter movement, but knowing that my role isn't the role that Black people, like I shouldn't be in leadership, right? I'm not in a leadership position, I'm in a supporting position. And so wanted to support that effort through the social media and the art making. Yeah.
Thank you both for sharing the stories. I think it's always interesting to understand where you got there. We're so glad that you did take those paths. I think there's just one more question that's come in, which is, as you look back at the exhibit now, did the subject matter take on a new urgency after the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath? And would you update it now if you could?
That's a good question. I think that, I mean, for me, oh man, I think for me, I would still put the same people because some of those people are still doing incredible work, you know, like Biol Yoon, who I did a portrait of in the exhibition, when I put that portrait up, she hadn't yet launched the new youth-led anti-war organization called Dissenters. And now it's fully launched and fully, you know, like actively recruiting young people on campuses to challenge war and militarism, or the way that U.S. Militarism and war impacts people across the globe. So I would definitely include her, of course, Miriam, of course, Sarah. So I don't think I would change anything about the portraits. I think what I would change is I would just have had more time to include so many pieces on that timeline of 10 years worth of organizing in Chicago. I think I would want to add like an entirely new wall of like way more stuff that has happened, because what I'm seeing in this new moment is a lot of new energy and a lot of new people who are trying to recreate things that already exist. And I just want to be like, no, don't waste your time doing that already exists. Just join those people and you know, support the work that's already happening, being led by people directly impacted, right? So I think, yeah, there would be a lot of that. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, actually, like, I think when Ross first reached out to us in the summer, I was thinking about the moment that we're in, specifically here in Chicago, seeing all the protests that were happening, and thinking that, well, you know, what I had included in my photos in the exhibit are directly related, you know, to what is currently being called for, because those struggles, you know, for justice, the many different calls for justice that have been happening over the years, it is directly related to building a world in which everyone's needs are met, you know, in which the way that we relate to each other, you know, is transformed. And it's basically building a different world. You know, it's like little building blocks. And that's what abolition is. And so now people are talking about abolition left and right. And it's like, yeah, I'm really happy that people are talking about it. And but some of them think that it's so new to them. And, you know, I've tried to tell them, actually, you know, I've seen your work, you know, I've seen you fighting for housing justice, you know, and I've seen you fighting, you know, for schools. And that's part of the work too. That's part of the work of abolition, so that people can like rethink what it means to participate in the work of abolition in the present, building towards that abolitionist future for all of us.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you, and particularly for the amazing work that you're doing and for the inspiration. And we're just very grateful. And Sarah, we consider anybody that went to UAC for one class to be an alumna. So we're going to welcome you into that family. So thank you to both of you. And thank you to Ross for all of your help and for leading the conversation. We're so grateful to all of you for your knowledge. And again, thank you for your continued great work. I'm very grateful for it. Real quickly, please join us for our next Alumni Exchange event, which will be on Wednesday, September 16th at noon Central Standard Time, which will feature UIC alumna Deb Venable as she presents The Keys to the Virtual Connection, which will be an interactive discussion that will explore how we truly build relationships to better connect with others, whether it's new clients, your organization's leadership, or your sales team in this new distance environment. You can find more at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that short survey that I mentioned. Thank you again to our panelists. for all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you again at the Alumni Exchange. Have a great rest of your evening, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.